Have you ever had a plan to do something and the plan was laid out perfectly, but the problem was the plan relied on somebody else to do his part and that person didn't live up to his end of the deal? Well, today we're going to see what happened when this happened to Moses and the Israelites on this week's lesson. Hello, welcome to this week's lesson. I'm Brian Vermeer. We're continuing our study in the book of Numbers, and the Israelites have reached the promised land, and we're going to see what happens here. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you, if you enjoy these videos, please like, subscribe, all that. And if you would like to help support me, please consider donating to my Patreon page. For as little as $5 a month, you can get some exclusive content. YouTube doesn't pay me anything. And also, if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. Any questions about the Bible, Christianity, anything like that. I've been considering possibly doing a question and answer video sometime. So, let's get to today's lesson here. We're in Numbers chapter 13. The Israelites left Mount Sinai. They traveled north. They're right now at the southern border of the Promised Land. They are ready to go in. But before they go in, they need to do what we called in the military a recon. That is to send in a small group to look around and just see what's there and gather intelligence and then bring it back so that they can plan their attack on the Promised Land. So let's take a look at Numbers chapter 13, verses 17 through 20 and see what Moses wants the Israelites to do. Verse 17 says, When Moses sent them to scout out the land of Canaan, he told them, Go up this way to the Negev, then go up into the hill country. See what the land is like, and whether the people who live there are strong or weak, few or many. Is the land they live in good or bad? Are the cities they live in encampments or fortifications? Is the land fertile or unproductive? Are there trees in it or not? Be courageous. Bring back some fruit from the land. It was ripe season for the first ripe grapes. So Moses has called 12 spies. He asked each tribe to provide a man, and these men are going to go into the land and they're going to scout it out. And Moses has several things here that he specifically wants them to look for. He says, see what the land is like and see whether the people who live there are strong or weak. Are these people that we're going to have to put up a heavy fight against, or are these people that we can just take over with no problem? Are there few or many? In other words, what parts of the land have few people living in it? What parts of the land have many people living in it? Is it good or bad? What parts of the land is good land for farming? What parts of the land are not good for farming? In other words, when we get in, what parts do we want to make sure that we can settle in? And what parts do we want to avoid or stay away from? Are the cities they live in encampments or fortifications? Are they just, tent-dwelling nomads, living in there? Or do they have cities with walls? It's been 400 years since Jacob and his family went to Egypt, so they don't know how the land has changed since they left. Have the people there built walled cities that it's going to take, a military strategy to try to go in and conquer? In other words, how hard is it going to be to conquer these people? Is the land fertile or unproductive? How good is the soil for growing things? And what parts of it are good? What parts of it are better than others? Because another thing that he's going to have to do is divide up this land among the 12 tribes. And he wants to make sure that each tribe has good farming land and each tribe has, good water supplies and things like that. So he wants to know, where all the good farming land is, where the water is, and just how good all this land is. Are there trees in it or not? They've been wandering through the desert for 40 years. They haven't seen a tree now since they left Egypt. And I love that statement because this reminds me when I was young, I spent my first couple of years of my life living in Oklahoma. And then my dad was transferred to Arkansas. And I remember Mom telling me, I was too young to remember at the time, but my mother told me that as we came across the border from Oklahoma into Arkansas, or at least, thereabouts, she says my older sister, a couple years older than I am, looked around and said, "Look, Mommy, trees." She was excited because where we lived in Oklahoma, there were no trees. I've seen photographs of it. There were no trees for miles. And, so coming into Arkansas and living in the Ouachita Mountains and the Ouachita Forest there were trees everywhere. And my sister was excited to finally, live in a place where there were trees. But that's what Moses is asking here. Are there trees? Are there fruit trees and things like that? And then he says to be strong and courageous. So as you go into this land, scout it out. Don't be afraid of the people that live there. Be strong, courageous, and bring back some of the fruit. In other words, don't just come back and tell us about it. Show us what the fruit is like there. Because Moses has then got to motivate the rest of the people to be able to go in and take it. So he wants to show them literally what the fruit of their labor is going to be. Here is good food from the place, that God is sending us. Now, remember last week we talked about they were complaining because they haven't had anything but manna to eat, for the last year. And they're wanting something different. So Moses is saying, bring some of this fruit back so these people will see when we go in and take this land, you'll be able to eat food like this. And maybe that will help motivate them to go in and take the land. So Moses has this plan. The plan is we're going to scout this land out. They're going to come back. They're going to tell us how great the land is. And then we're going to go in and we're going to conquer this land. So let's see what the scout report was when they came back. Verses 21 to 25 of Numbers chapter 13. So they went up and scouted out the land from the wilderness of Zin as far as Rehob, near the entrance to Hamath. Then they went up through the Negev and came to Hebron, where Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai, the descendants of Anak, were living. Hebron was built 7 years before Zoan in Egypt. When they came to Eshcol Valley, they cut down a branch with a single cluster of grapes, which was carried on a pole by 2 men. They also took some pomegranates and figs. That place was called Eshcol Valley because of the cluster of grapes the Israelites cut there. At the end of the 40 days, they returned from scouting out the land. So here we see the 12 spies. They went in and they did what they were told. They went and scouted out the land, and you can pull a map out and look up all these places, basically saying they went from the wilderness of Zin. That's where Moses and the encampment of the Israelites is. As far as Rehob, near the entrance of Hamath, that is talking about how far north they went. And it says they went up through the Negev, through the desert there, and came to Hebron. Hebron is the city where Abraham lived before he left. And Moses makes a point here to say that Hebron was built 7 years before the city of Zoan in Egypt. So this is a way of saying, look, Hebron was already there. We knew that city was already there because that's where Abraham lived. And this also shows that Moses had a knowledge of Egypt. This gives authenticity to the book of Numbers, that it was written by someone who knew Egypt and knew when the city of Zoan had been built. And then it says they came to Eshcol Valley, and they cut down a branch with a single cluster of grapes, which was carried on a pole by 2 men. I'm sure you've seen that illustration before. I used it for the thumbnail for this video. A large cluster of grapes, a single cluster that was so large it took 2 men carrying it on a pole in order to bring it back. Moses said, bring back some of the fruit. This is some of what they brought back. It says they also brought back some pomegranates and figs. So they've got fresh fruit here, which they haven't eaten now in over a year. It's been about a year now since they've left Egypt. So they're excited. They're, about seeing this land. And it says, that place there was called Eshcol Valley. I'm sure the word Eshcol there is simply Hebrew word for grapes or something like that, because of the cluster of grapes the Israelites cut there. Now that tells me that it was the Israelites who called the place Eshcol Valley, and not the people who already lived there. They spent 40 days cutting down. They spent 40 days exploring this land, going up through all the land. They made a very thorough scouting report of all of this land. Another thing it says here, though, that we need to take notice of, because this is going to come in the next section here. It says they went up, came to Hebron, where Ahiman, Shishai, and Talmai, the descendants of Anak, were living. Well, who is Anak and who are these three men? These three men are apparently the leaders of the people that live there, but it specifically says they are descendants of Anak, or in the Hebrew there, the Anakim. You may have heard of the term the Anakim before. Well, who are the Anakim? The Anakim literally means the long-necked people. And it's taken by many to believe that these were a group of people, a race of people that were unusually tall. We would call them giants. Now, not giants in the sense of, 30, 40 feet high, anything like that. But giants like maybe Goliath was. Goliath was 9'6". So he was probably a descendant of Anak. So Anak was probably this giant man. Some try to equate Anak with the Nephilim. That is the people mentioned way back in the book of Genesis before the flood, that some believe were the offspring of angels and human women. When it says there were giants in the earth in those days, the word literally there's the word Nephilim. I personally do not believe that angels reproduced with women. I don't think angels are able to reproduce. But it is possible that some of these demonic angels, not impregnated, but possessed men who then went into these women, who then raped these women. And because of them being possessed, they were able to give birth to these mighty men, mainly evil men. And so legends came up among the people who lived there about large, giant people. So the Anakim are tall people who probably some people thought may have been descended from these giants. However, we know there are no descendants of those giants because those giants all died in the flood. The Nephilim were around before the flood. The flood killed them all. So the Anakim are descended from Noah, just like everybody else on the earth at this time is. But this is just a group of people that are taller than normal, and that might be intimidating then to some of the Israelites as they go in. So let's look at verses 26 to 31 now and see what the results of this scouting survey actually are and what the recommendations are that the spies give to Moses. It says, the men went back to Moses, Aaron, and the entire Israelite community in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. They brought back a report for them and the whole community, and they showed them the fruit of the land. They reported to Moses, we went into the land where you sent us. Indeed, it is flowing with milk and honey, and here is some of its fruit. However, the people living in that land are strong, and the cities are large and fortified. We also saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites are living in the land of the Negev. The Hethites, Jebusites, and Amorites live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live by the sea and along the Jordan. Then Caleb quieted the people in the presence of Moses and said, let's go up now and take possession of the land, because we can certainly conquer it. But the men who had gone up with them responded, we can't attack the people, because they are stronger than we are. So Moses has this whole plan. They were going to go in, they were going to scout out the land, they were going to bring back some of the food, and this would encourage the Israelites to go in and take this land. But now, a couple of the spies, or actually most of the spies, are throwing a monkey wrench into the works here. It says the fruit is good. The land is great. Here's some of the fruit we brought back. Look how great it is. But they have large fortified cities there, such as Jericho and Ai, and then some of the others that you can read about when they actually conquered the land in the book of Joshua. They have large fortified cities. We saw the descendants of Anak there. We saw the Anakim there. We saw these large, tall people there. They're stronger than we are. There's more of them. It says also the Amalekites, the Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, they all live there. I don't know if the Israelites were thinking that, this was going to be just an empty land that they were just going to go in and settle. God has told them many times that, you're going into a land that is currently occupied by all these people. You're going to have to go in and conquer it. Now, some may question, is it right for the Israelites to go in and conquer this land that these other people are already living in? We need to remember, though, this land was promised to the Israelites by God. The Israelites were already living there. Jacob and his sons were already living there when they left. And then when they left, these other people moved in. And now the Israelites are simply being asked to go in and take back what is theirs, what is rightfully theirs. I can't help but draw a parallel to some of the debate today about the disputes between the Israelis and the Palestinians over the land of Israel. Now, I remember some of my students were once asking me, why there was fighting going on in Israel at one time. And I just said, look, you have two groups of people there. You've got the Israelis who say God gave us this land because he gave it to our father Abraham. And then you've got the Palestinians who say God gave this land to our father Abraham. And Palestinians are descended from Abraham's son Ishmael. I said, they've been fighting over that land for 5,000 years. It's not going to end anytime soon. But hearing people today say that it wasn't right for the Israelis to just go in and take the land away from the Palestinians. What they forget is the Israelis were there first. The Israelis were driven out of that land by the Romans in AD 70, and then the Palestinians moved in. So the Israelis are simply trying to take back the land that is rightfully theirs. So you can probably see where I stand on this side of the debate. I'm a full supporter of the nation of Israel because I believe God gave that land to Jacob and his sons, which are the ancestors of the modern-day Israelis. And even as far back as here, we see Moses, telling his people, this land is rightfully yours. And God has already said that we're supposed to go in and take this land. And Caleb, who's partnered with Joshua and Caleb were two of the spies. They're the only two of these 12 spies that came back and said, let's go in and take this land. They're the only two that trusted that God had a plan for them to take this land. The other 10 said, no, we can't take it because those people are stronger than we are. And what they're forgetting is God has already promised this land to them. So if they go in, certainly God will give it to them. It'll take work. It'll take them having to actually go in and conquer the cities. But God has already said, God is using the Israelites as a judgment against the people who live in that land because the people who live in that land don't believe. These are people, remember, these are all people descended from Noah. These are people whose ancestors all originally had faith in God. These are people who have lost their faith, have turned away from their faith. Now they're worshiping idols. They're worshiping Baal and Ashtaroth and some of these other gods. And God is wanting to use the Israelites as a judgment against them. He told the Israelites, you go in there and you take that whole area. You conquer that entire area. Don't let any of them still live. If the Israelites had done what they were told, David wouldn't have had to put up with the Philistines. But the people are afraid. The people saw what was in front of them, and even though they saw the reward would be great, they also saw the obstacles. And they thought the reward is not worth the obstacles. even though God has already promised that they would end up victorious. You know, I said at the beginning, you can have a plan. We all make plans to do things, and we think that our plans are foolproof and perfect, but we forget oftentimes that our plans also rely on the willingness of other people to do their part in it. And sometimes all it takes is one person to not be willing to go along with the plan, and the whole thing falls apart. Well, that's what happens here. The Israelites, as a large group, listened to the 10 unfaithful spies rather than to the 2 faithful spies. And they said, we're not going in, and you can't make us. We've mentioned that the theme of the book of Numbers is rebellion. We've already seen a couple of times that they have rebelled against, God's provisions. Now they're even rebelling against God's plan. They have come to the place, to the end of the quest, and they're refusing to finish it. So what's God going to do about it? God says, fine, you don't want to go in, then you're not going in. You are going to wander around in the desert for 40 years. Until every one of you who is above the age of 30 has died. And your children will be the ones who go in and take this land. The only 2 of these spies that we know that actually went in and conquered Israel were Joshua and Caleb. Even Moses, Aaron, and Miriam didn't get to go in. He said, y'all aren't going to see it. Since y'all don't want to go in and take it, your children are going to be the ones who go in and take it. And you, although you were the ones who were the slaves in Egypt, and you were the ones that I was trying to rescue and bring here, you're not going to get to see any of the reward of all your work. You're just going to wander around in the desert for 40 years until you've all died off. And then the next generation will be the ones. You see, when God has a plan, his plan is going to be done. And if God calls you to be part of his fulfillment of his plan, and you refuse, that doesn't mean God's plan is thwarted. He'll just find somebody else. And you won't get the benefit of it. You won't get the reward for it. You see, we forget sometimes that when God tells us to do something, he's not going to tell us to do something that we can't do. He'll give us everything we need, including his own help, to do whatever he has called us to do. And as long as you are alive, God still has something he wants you to do. So you need to be finding out what God's will is for your life. If you don't have a relationship with Christ, then the first thing is God wants you to do is to accept Jesus as your Savior. And then after you've done that, then he has other things that he's going to want you to do. Some of them will be easy, some of them will be hard. God never promised us that doing his will would always be, the easiest thing that there is. But he never says, I'm going to tell you to do something that you cannot do. At least with his help. And if you don't do it, he may just find somebody else who will. So God has a plan. And we're all part of God's plan. But are we going to be like Joshua and Caleb and say, yes, Lord, I'm ready to do what you want me to do? Or are we going to be like the 10 spies and say, nope, I can't do that. That's too much trouble. That's too much work. And then let God say, fine, you're going to miss out on the reward then. I had this great reward for you already to give. But now you're not going to get it. I'm going to give it to someone else. When God tells us to do something, we do it. We should do it. We shouldn't have questions. We shouldn't think, I can't do this. Don't be like the rebellious Israelites and go against God's plan. Next week, we're going to see some of the things that happen to them as they are wandering for 40 years. So, please like, subscribe, support, and I'll see you again next week.